Welcome to Braden Castle Park. Part of this overview of the park's history was originally created in the 1980s thanks to Imogene Crow, a longtime resident of our community. This updated edition also uses dozens of historical photos and other images to tell the story of our past. What is Braden Castle Park? It is many things. It is a plot of ground. It is a castle. It is a campground. It is a small community of historic homes. It is a parade of people that progress from historic man through explorers, fishermen, early settlers, sugarcane farmers, tourists, campers, and winter residents, sometimes known as snowbirds. All these things have now come together as Braden Castle Park. Braden Castle Park is on the west coast of Florida, about halfway down the peninsula from Tampa. It sits along the Manatee River where the Braden River joins it. There on the south side of the Manatee and the west side of the Braden, you will find Braden Castle Park. It is not very big in area, just under 35 acres. Hardly a line in the distance as you look across the broad expanse of the Manatee that is more than a mile across at this point. Who knows what Braden Castle Park looked like in prehistoric times? There were birds and animals and reptiles roaming in its wilderness. Mammals and fish swam in the mighty waters that touched its shores. In fact, the river was named for one of these creatures that populated its waters, the manatee, which we sometimes call a sea cow and the Indians called a big beaver. At least 12,000 years ago, prehistoric men may have hunted mammoths and mastodons within its boundary. By around 5000 BC, Gulf Coast people dwelt upon it. They hunted, fished, and had some prehistoric tools, ornaments, and utensils. They left evidence of their presence, their food, and their possession in large refuse mounds now called middens, upon which they often built their shelters. Early explorers found two huge 30-foot middens on either side of the mouth of the Manatee, and smaller ones scattered around Tampa Bay and on the shores of the Manatee. Around 1560, Spanish explorers sailed into the area and found a tribe of Indians that they called Tocababas, whose villages seem to have clustered along the Gulf Coast and along the shores of the Manatee River. These Indians wore little but jewelry and stained their bodies with natural red dyes. They carved many things out of wood and used stones, shells, and bones to make tools and other domestic needs. They were expert farmers, growing maize and pumpkins. They gathered wild fruits, nuts, and roots for food, trapped and speared fish, skate and dolphin, and gathered shellfish. Probably the earliest white people to land on our shores came as early as 1527. Privateers thinking to find gold, encouraged by the Spanish rulers hoping to establish a foothold in this new territory. May 30th, 1539, Hernando de Soto, a Spanish explorer, anchored at the mouth of the Manatee River. He was searching for El Dorado, the city of gold. The exploration party is believed to have traveled along the south side of the Manatee searching for a good crossing. In the mid-1700s, the Florida Indians came to be called Seminole. They were not native Floridians, but mostly Muskogee and Cree, fleeing Alabama and Georgia, driven out by the white settlers. In 1821, President Andrew Jackson received Florida from the Spanish, and the Seminoles should have become U.S. citizens. However, the white settlers wanted the land, and the Seminoles were relegated to being deported to Arkansas. Angry and frustrated, they struck back at the white settlers, and so began the 3 Seminole Wars. Congress passed the Armed Occupation Act in 1842. It offered 160-acre parcels to settlers of small farms who would arm themselves and defend against the Indians. Each claimant obligated himself to build a habitable building and live there 5 years. One of the first settlers along the Manatee was Joshua Gates. He and his family moved to the area that was to become the village of Manatee. They built a log cabin on a cleared area of their quarter section that showed evidence of an old Indian village and a great spring of fresh water. During the early 1840s, other settlers began filtering into the area. Dr. Joseph A. Braden and his brother Hector, originally from Virginia, came around 1842. This followed the collapse of the Union Bank in Tallahassee, where they, like others, had lost their heavily mortgaged plantations. Hector Braden practiced law, but Joseph, although a graduate physician, did not practice medicine. Joseph, Virginia, and their 3 children first lived in a log house near where Old Main Street in Bradenton is now. In 1848, he began securing land along Braden Creek until he had holdings of over 1,100 acres. He expanded this into one of the largest sugarcane plantations in the area. Dr. Braden had brought 50 to 90 slaves with him, and they worked in developing 300 to 900 acres. One interesting note about the importance of the slaves is found in the record of a land transfer of part of the present Braden Castle land at a later date. It reads, quote, "Lands totaling 580 acres for $4,200 and one Negro woman named Elizabeth Johnson," unquote. The Bradens built a sugar mill 2 miles south of the present Braden Castle on Sugar Creek. It housed an expensive iron mill factory built in New York and shipped in by schooner in the fall of 1848. The sugar cane was cut and run through these huge iron rollers that pressed out the juice. Then the juice was boiled down in large vats and then contained in hogshead barrels of sugar and molasses. These were then poled down Sugar Creek and then Braden Creek and into the Manatee. There they were quite likely loaded onto the Elizabeth Fisk, a moderate draft sailing ship that carried the sugar and molasses to the port at Tampa, where it was offloaded onto bigger ships that traded all over the world. On a slight knoll that sloped to the water's edge of the confluence of the Manatee River and Braden Creek, Dr. Braden built a large plantation house in 1850. Like most of the homes along the river was in their front yard. Crude docks provided landings for their sloops and boats. A few paths and rough wagon roads were cut to various homes and farms, but the river was the main highway. The house was built mostly of tabby. This was made from burnt oyster shells, crushed and sifted, making lime. Slaves waded out into the river at low tide and scooped up the shells with shovels and put them into gunny sacks. Deep pits were prepared and the shells were burnt in these. The lime was then mixed with water, sand, and more shells. It dried into a porous substance almost as hard and durable as stone. Wooden forms were made and the wet mixtures were poured into these troughs. When these hardened, the frames were removed and another layer was framed and poured. The holes that appeared in the ruins were where these frames were held together by wooden pegs. The walls were 20 inches thick and both the inner and outer walls were made of tabby. The house was a 2-story structure facing mostly east. Each floor was divided into 2 sections by a grand hall running east and west. The outer wall of this hall was sided in wood and contained a grand staircase. There were 4 large rooms on each floor, 2 on each side of the halls. The hall was 40 feet long and 15 feet wide. Each room had a large fireplace and 4 windows. All the floors were of hand-hewn pine planking, and the pyramidal roof was covered with red cedar shingles. Although the Bradens, like most early planters, were well off, they had to borrow heavily to maintain their plantations. They mortgaged their lands, crops, and slaves. However, they did live lavishly. Because of the grandeur of the house in relationship to the surrounding homes, it came to be called Braden Castle. Reverend E.J. Gates, an early settler, wrote, quote, "In his castle home were royally entertained friends of the Braden family. The proverbial Southern hospitality was dispensed with a lavish hand." Another writer wrote report that on Sundays a family that lived up the Braden came up the creek in a rowboat, landed at Dr. Braden's dock, and accompanied them to the Manatee Methodist Church in the Braden's carriole. During the Seminole Wars, some of the Indians had escaped deportation and established villages in the Everglades. One of the important chiefs of the Seminoles was Billy Bowleg. He was described as a dangerous foe of the white man. He was short and stout, often wearing a calico frock with leather leggings, belt, and cloak. His head was wrapped in a silver-banded turban crowned with black ostrich feathers. Army expeditions invaded and destroyed their camps and crops. The Indians retaliated. In the early spring of 1856, the Seminoles, infuriated because the Army had destroyed their gardens and encouraged by Billy Bowlegs, began staging raids on the white settlers. One such raid occurred at the Braden home, March 2, 1856. Slave girls in the Braden household spotted Indians on the piazza while the family was at dinner. She warned the men who, using a repeating rifle, drove off the marauders. Rifle fire was exchanged, and the retreating Seminoles stole several slaves and 3 of Dr. Braden's best mules that they used as pack animals carrying their loot. The next day the Indians were followed, located, and killed. For about 9 months the Manatee residents sheltered in Fort Branch that had been constructed near the Indian Spring in Manatee. Braden Castle was also used as a refuge. The very next year, Joseph Braden faced financial ruin. The sugar market had shrunk noticeably with the Panic of 1857, and Braden had mortgaged his property heavily to Daniel Ladd in Tallahassee for $8,412. Ladd foreclosed, taking all the property, slaves, and home. The Braden family moved out and away. Braden Castle was deserted. For the next 10 years, the property lay fallow, open to anyone who wanted to farm there. In 1867, following the Civil War, Ladd sold 1,100 acres along the Manatee River to Mary and John Pilo for Mary's parents, General James Cooper and Mrs. Ferroby Cooper, who, along with the Pilos, moved to Manatee. The Coopers moved into Braden Castle and made a series of improvements, including the addition of the wooden cupola. The interior of the castle may have looked similar to this period room, as it is reported that Mrs. Ferroby Cooper was a charming hostess and made her home a delight for family and guests. Hence the name of Braden Castle became synonymous with good times. The grounds, shaded by beautiful trees, afforded a delightful place for community affairs such as 4th of July celebrations, tournaments, races, and Sunday school picnics. Cruises on the river afforded guests affordable fishing, shelling, and sailing. Braden Castle now lay deserted and abandoned. The grounds toward the river, however, became a favorite picnic area, and picnickers enjoyed having their pictures taken around the castle. A Sunday school picnic from the Manatee Methodist Church. Then in 1903, a woods fire, reportedly set by vandals, destroyed the wooden part of the castle. Tabby alone remained, except for the ghosts of all those who had gone before. Now we move on to the early 1920s, after the horseless carriage was invented. Henry Ford's Model T, the Buick, and the Maxwell became available to the average American family. American people went on the move, loaded up the family and some make-do camping equipment, and set out to see the USA. One such family was the Allmeyers. In November of 1921, Ruth, a young girl at the time, and her family came to Florida for the winter. Ruth kept a diary that represents and describes early tourists, similar to the ones who came to Braden Castle Park later. She writes, "We left our home at Delphi, Ohio on Wednesday, November 9th, 1921 at 7:30 a.m. after breakfast. The party consisted of 3 Model Ts and 1 Buick with side curtains and mudguards. Crossed the Kentucky River and climbed numerous hills. Camped at about 4 o'clock, got our tents put up and went to bed at 8:30. 5 days later we had supper at a long table at a hotel. Mama and Papa stayed in the hotel all night. Sister Ruby and I slept in the machine right across the street in a public parking place. Last night the rats were awful in the hotel, and Nellie and Walter had Bobby the dog in their room catching rats." On November 15, we had to climb one mountain, and all the Fords got across a creek we had to cross, but the Buick hit the water too fast and got the engine all wet, causing a short circuit in the spark plugs. The men all pushed the car out of the creek. That night the whole neighborhood where we were camped came to see us after supper. We had a regular party. The young folks rode horseback and played hide and seek. They came in buggies, too. They had never seen campers. They gave us milk and bread. We built a big campfire and sat around it. The next morning when we left, all we hit were rotten roads, just mud and chuck holes. We had to get our engine overhauled and new brake bands put in. After that, the roads were nothing but mud, ran out of gas on a steep hill, and had to be pulled over the top. We had to ferry across the Tennessee River, which was quite an experience. Mama was afraid the boat would sink or something happen. We had to wait 2 hours on the ferry to take us across. It held 3 cars at a time. After that, we hit a stretch of good roads and moved along 25 to 30 miles an hour, made 200 miles in 2 days. We stopped on a hill and looked at a car burning up. There was a short circuit in the wires and the thing exploded into flames. Before this happened, we had seen 5 other cars that had burned and had been left by the roadside. We reached Gainesville and pitched camp in the most wonderful tourist camp. Electric lights, shower baths, and a little grocery where oranges were 15 cents a dozen. At 5 o'clock we had an ice cream social. It sure was good. 1 ticket was a dime. At 7:30 we went to a meeting of the tin can tourists and joined that evening. We all have a tin can tied to the front of our cars with the initials TCT painted on it. Doesn't cost a thing to belong, and we have signs and a password to tell each other. You get a deduction on gas and in some places groceries if you are a tin canner down here. We learn more about the TCT from Ann Harold, an original settler here. She says, quote, "If one car broke down on the side of the roadway, its occupants would give a sign making a C shaped with their thumb and index finger, and passing tin canners would stop and give aid. One motto of the band was to leave each site cleaner than they had found it," unquote. Here is a photo taken in 1923 of a bungalow on wheels. We got to Bradenton about 2 o'clock November 26. It took us 15 days to travel about 1,000 miles from Ohio. We camped at the ballpark on 9th Street for a few days. Then the men decided to venture out looking for a camping place for the winter. They decided on Ybor City in Tampa, where there was a sizable tin canner group. As living quarters, they built a wooden platform as a floor, built up the sides for a way, and then used their tent as a roof. This made one big room, which they curtained off into smaller rooms. March 1st, 1922, the Allmeyer family started home. About 12 miles from Ferrisville, Florida, a man was working on the roads, and we had to make new tracks through the soft, sandy mud, and it was awful. Reaching Ohio, they had 2 tire punctures and burned out 2 connecting rods. About 150 miles from home, they had to get a new engine. Had to drive about 20 miles an hour to keep the engine from getting hot. having put in new. So glad to get home March 25th, and everyone was glad to see us. By 1924, the permanent residents of Tampa became disenchanted with all the campers and tourists, and felt that without bringing money to the economy, they had become a liability, so they asked them to leave. One editorial is quoted as saying that these tourists came from the north, bringing a $10 bill and one suit of underwear, and never changed either. This picture, however, proves otherwise. At least they changed their long johns long enough to launder them. A group of tin can tourists, not being able to persuade the main group to join them, formed a new organization called the Camping Tourists of America. They determined to buy their own campground, as the tin canners were not allowed to own land. They scouted the area around Bradenton and came upon Braden Castle parcel that was for sale. Mrs. Harold says, quote, "We found this land by the Braden Castle, and it even had a well on it that had such force that it shot clear over to the castle when we opened it up. Well, right then and there we decided to buy the place." These hardy and determined Northerners were able to envision what this desolate place could become. On March 7, 1924, they signed an agreement to purchase 34.75 acres for $16,000. $700 was paid in cash as a down payment, signed by W.J. Houck, President, and R.W. Vaughn, Secretary. On March 10th, the purchase was made. These photographs show most of the people who furnished the money to pay it down on the property. They were Mr. Vaughn, Jacobs, Houck, Harding, Brim, Galloway, Kennedy, and Landis. These new owners were from all walks of life and included a doctor, lawyers, skilled tradesmen, and farmers. They came from many different states. They formed an association and filed for an article of incorporation. May 5, 1925, the Camping Tourists of America became official. The new owners drew up rules and bylaws and elected a board of directors consisting of 9 of the members. The Braden Castle Park territory came with both the Manatee and the Braden Rivers as borders. When the founders had their picture taken at the castle ruins in 1924, the Manatee and Braden Rivers were out of sight, with a growth of palmettos and trees. The first area needed was for camping. The wilderness near the castle was so dense they couldn't see the water. One of the first clearances between the castle and the river was made to bring the water into view. Soon, using machetes, axes, and saws, an area near the river was cleared and became the camping section. They moved in, bag and baggage, living in tents, cars, primitive homemade trailers, and campers. Each family owned some kind of firearm because they sometimes came home to find that a rattlesnake had moved in. The founders laid out a plan for the development of the village. Part of the property was divided into 200 lots, permanent home sites, each about 40 feet by 40 feet. A shareholder bought a share for $100 and was assigned one of these lots on which to build. Offers flocked in as previous members of the Tin Can Tourists and their friends wanted to own their own Florida land. As the new property owners journeyed south to this area, during those first years they brought their hammers, saws, and their dreams. The community must have seemed like a beehive during the winter periods from 1925 to 1929. By the end of the 20s, 177 of the 199 cottages had been built, mostly by the owners themselves. They were creative and even recycled the wood from parking cases in their construction. There was a sawmill just across the Braden River, a nearby source of lumber. In the fall of 1924, Imogene Crow's parents and grandparents came to Braden Castle and built their own little cottage close to Castle Green. Here are progressive photos taken as they worked on the house. They must have built a room 12 feet by 12 feet and the front porch and lived in it while they built the kitchen at the back and the garage. The HGTV program Tiny Houses had nothing on these pioneers. Later in the winter it looked like this. The car they drove down was in the yard. About 3 feet was added to the back of the house when inside plumbing was added. The little house remains basically unchanged and is a historic example of original building. The founders' plan designated an area that would include the business and social aspects of their new acquisition. The office occupied a conspicuous position in front. The frame part was built in the fall of 1925 under supervision of a carpenter, but with volunteer help. There were originally 3 rooms, one of which was used as living quarters for the custodian. The bell on the top had been a part of the camping area in Ybor City and was donated to the park. The pavilion was built in 1925 and contained the community hall. The community was almost self-contained. At the corner of Riverview Drive there was a store, with living quarters on the left side for people who ran the store. The addition on the right was once a Western Union office and later a post office, and across the street was the barber shop. The barber shop was eventually turned into rental property after the floor was scraped to get the tobacco spit off. There was even a fire station with its own fire engine. 3 fire bells, built from locomotive drive wheels, are located in different sections of the village. In case of a fire, a metal hammer hitting the rim would alert the residents, each with a different note. In February 1926, the men's clubhouse was authorized and constructed by the volunteers. The lure of the rivers resulted in 2 piers being built. The first was a fishing pier out into the Braden River on the east side of the area. The second stretched about 630 feet out to navigable water in the Manatee. At least twice it was damaged by hurricanes and rebuilt. In 1936, the Reverend and Mrs. Albert Leroy had moved into 33 Seminole Drive for their retirement. Across the street was a swampy area around a little tidal pool known as Alligator Pool. Mosquitoes, snakes, and other wildlife inhabited the area. Dr. Leroy decided to draw up a plan to create a lagoon, similar to one he had known in Africa, that would beautify the area. By 1940, money was raised in the community and the lagoon was dredged. It became a scenic place to rest and contemplate, as well as home to many shorebirds and once in a while even an alligator. Streets were paved, sometimes using deteriorating tabby from the castle ruins. Curbs were installed. Electric street lights pushed. Eventually, the Camping Tourists of America was renamed officially in 1956 as the Braden Castle Association Incorporated. Homeowners, as association members in good standing, were given a numbered certificate of membership. In the 1950s, when the Homestead Law came into being, the lots were deeded to the individual certificate owners. Each lot owner must be a dues-paying member of the association. The remaining acreage is still community property. The ruins of the castle itself was added to the National Register of Historic Places in 1972.